Vesel sem, da lahko med nami pozdravim tudi avtorja te knjige, gospoda Roda Dreherja, ki se je pri nas ustavil za kratek čas na sicer večmesečnem študijskem popotovanju in turneji po državah vzhodne Evrope. Je gost ustanove Danube Institute s sedežem na Dunaju, v Budimpešti. Zato posebej toplo pozdravljam tudi predsednika te ustanove, gospoda Johna O'Sullivana, ki sedi tam v tretji vrsti. Dobrodošli pri nas. On je legenda anglo-ameriškega konzervativnega žurnalizma, velik ljubitelj in sodelavec Margaret Thatcher in še marsikaj bi o njem lahko povedali. Dobrodošla oba v Ljubljani. Mislim, da si zaslužite pristen slovenski aplavz. Dreher je že dopoldne imel tiskovno konferenco, na kateri je kratko predstavil tole knjižno novost. To je ena od njegovih uspešnic, ki jih je v zadnjih letih izdal. Druga še ni prevedena v slovenščino, verjamem pa, da bo slej ko prej tudi našla pot, je Benedict Option in prav sveža ob spominskem letu na Danteja How can Dante save your life? Danes bo seveda na tem predavanju podrobneje predstavil zasnovo to knjige, svojo bistveno idejo, na koncu bo tudi priložnost za vprašanje, bi vam pa rad samo nekaj stavkih predstavil avtorja in pojasnil njegovo ozadje. Gospod se je rodil leta 1967 v ameriški zvezni državi Louisiana, danes pa je glavni urednik in bloger ameriške revije The American Conservative. Tudi danes med kosilom in predavanjem je pisal uvodnik za to izdajo. Ter avtor številnih knjig, ki smo jih že omenili, teme njegovih zapisov pa obsegajo vse od vere in politike do filma in kulture. No, ta njegova uspešnica Ne živite, od laži s podnaslovom Priročnik za krščanske disidente v tej knjigi je zbral pričevanja krščanskih pričevalcev, disidentov, tudi mučencev iz vzhodne Evrope, ki so trdno vztrajali v času sovjetskega režima in preživeli. No in kdo je Američanki za prevladujočo politično korektnost sodobnega časa izzivalno trdi, da se totalitarizem danes tudi po zahodnem svetu, v zahodni Evropi, v Združenih državah širi predvsem v mehki obliki, tako imenovanega mehkega totalitarizma z obljubami zabave, užitka in udobja. To je ena njegovih pomenljivih izjav, ki bo morda tudi na nek način rdeča nit tega predavanja, da ljudje, tudi kristjani, v sodobnem svetu lahko čez noč postanemo izobčenci zgolj zato, ker izražamo politično nekorektna mnenja. Gospod Dreher, jaz sem zelo vesel, da vas smem pozdraviti na založbi Družina in vam prepuščam govorniški oder. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much for coming tonight. I hope you'll forgive me for pouring myself a glass of water. It's very hot here. I come from the American South, from South Louisiana, in fact, and people say, oh, you must be used to this hot weather. No. You never get used to it. Well, I'll tell you how I started to write this book, came to write this book. In the spring of 2015, a prominent American physician contacted me after a disturbing conversation with his elderly mother, a Czech immigrant who, in her youth, served a jail term as a political prisoner of the communist regime in her homeland. In fact, she had been sent to prison and tortured because she refused government orders to stop attending prayer meetings at her church. The doctor was shaken, and he thought somebody should know what had happened. The doctor told me, my mother says that the things going on in this country now remind her of what Czechoslovakia was like when communism first came. This man had spent his entire life listening to her and his late father, also a Czech immigrant, talking about communism, but had never had reason to worry that their stories would apply to America until now. Well, this sounded kind of alarmist to me, but after that conversation, whenever I would meet people who had grown up in the Soviet bloc, I would tell them what the old Czech woman had said and ask them if they agreed. Every single one of them said yes. And if you would talk to them long enough, they would complain that whenever they try to warn Americans, nobody believes them. What are they seeing that frightens them? They are seeing a growing acceptance of an extremely intolerant left-wing ideology that is destroying free thought and free speech in the name of defending victims. They are seeing people losing their jobs and having their reputations destroyed because they dissent from this ideology. They're seeing academics corrupted by it. They are seeing people lie about what they really believe just to protect their livelihoods. They are seeing children turn on their parents over ideology. They're seeing books banned for offending against the ideology. They're seeing ideologically deranged mobs turn on dissidents and hound them both online and in real life. They're seeing outright lies told against those who question this ideology in an effort to ruin them. And they are seeing stone-cold fear take control of people who are deathly afraid of being canceled. Could these people be exaggerating the threat? Sure, it's possible. But here's the thing. The more you look into the evidence that the United States is stumbling toward a soft form of totalitarianism, the harder it is to dismiss these warnings. And I say the United States, but it's also happening to some extent here in Europe. And as we know, most of the things that happen in the United States will eventually reach Europe. I used the T word there, totalitarianism. Let's define that term. When we think of totalitarianism, what naturally comes to mind is gulags, secret police, torture, and other aspects of communist police states. Well, we don't have any of that here, and we probably won't ever. So why do I call this soft totalitarianism? Strictly speaking, a totalitarian state is one in which a single political ideology and its adherents hold all the political power. And everything in life is politicized. Totalitarian states don't just want your obedience, they want your mind and your soul. In the 20th century, there were two great English-language dystopian novels, George Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Because the Soviet Union was like Orwell's fictional police state, and because Orwell was the better writer, it is Orwell who defined totalitarianism for us. Orwell imagined a totalitarian state in which Big Brother enforced conformity by inflicting pain and terror. Now that's as hard totalitarianism can get. By contrast, Huxley imagined a totalitarian state in which the so-called world controllers managed conformity by keeping everybody entertained and jacked up with drugs, porn, and sex. The Huxleyan state wants to eliminate pain, boredom, and unhappiness. Mustafa Mond, the world controller for Europe, calls it, quote, Christianity without tears. Well, I contend that in our society, we are facing not the hard totalitarianism of Orwell, but the soft totalitarianism of Huxley. In Budapest a few years back, my friend Anna told me that she found it hard to discuss the struggles in her own life as a young wife and a mother with friends. As soon as she would say that she and her husband had been arguing or that she was exhausted caring for their little boy, her friends would tell her, oh, get divorced, or put the boy in daycare, go back to work, be happy. She told me, I can't make them understand that I love my husband and that I love being a wife and a mom. They can't understand why anybody would choose to struggle. I said to Anna, it sounds like you're fighting for your right to be unhappy. Yes, she said. I then explained to her that that is what John the Savage, the dissident in Brave New World, also fights for. Well, soft totalitarianism depends on our fear of being unhappy. John the Savage tells Mustafa Mond, quote, I don't want comfort. I want God. I want poetry. I want real danger. I want freedom. I want goodness. I want sin. Mond thinks the man is crazy, and I imagine Anna's friends feel the same way about her. In my country, we're now seeing a generation willing to see religious liberty, free speech, and other important political freedoms taken away from us for the sake of creating a safe, tightly managed society where nobody has to feel anxious, sad, or unhappy. A college professor once told me that he gave up teaching Brave New World because almost none of his students considered it to be a dystopia. They all thought Huxley's soft totalitarianism sounded like paradise. There are other signs that our civilization is ripe for totalitarianism. In 1951, the political philosopher Hannah Arendt published The Origins of Totalitarianism, a detailed study of why, in the 20th century, nations had succumbed to fascism and communism. Though the two totalitarian systems were at opposite ideological poles, both emerged from similar social and political conditions, Arendt found, conditions that are strikingly present in the West today. The most important one is loneliness and social atomization. Totalitarian movements, said Arendt, are, quote, mass organizations of atomized, isolated individuals. What prepares men for totalitarian domination in the non-totalitarian world, she said, is the fact that loneliness, once a borderline experience, usually suffered in certain marginal social conditions like old age, has become an everyday experience of the ever-growing masses of our century. Another sign of a pre-totalitarian society is widespread susceptibility to propaganda and ideology. Whether out of cynicism or misplaced idealism, the willingness to surrender one's moral responsibility to be honest for the sake of a politically useful narrative opened the door to tyranny. In pre-totalitarian nations, wrote Arendt, hating respectable society was so narcotic that elites were willing to accept monstrous forgeries in historiography for the sake of striking back at those who, in their view, had excluded the underprivileged and the oppressed from the memory of mankind. Well, I think of this point today when we see the spread of ideologies that teach the young to hold their traditions and the history of their country and civilization in contempt. Left-wing mobs today in the United States and Great Britain topple statues in the name of supposed liberation from the chains of the past. Indeed, hatred of the past is one of the basic weapons that the totalitarian despot uses to gain control of the people. Well, why were so many people of the 20th century willing to believe ideological lies? Because totalitarian ideology was a political religion that provided meaning, purpose, and solidarity for masses of people who had been alienated from their traditional sources. As traditional Christianity declined, these political pseudo-religions filled the God-shaped hole in the body politic. The Russian-American historian Yuri Slezkin characterizes Bolshevism, that is Soviet communism, as an apocalyptic millennial political cult. It divided the world crudely into the damned, capitalists, the bourgeoisie, and the elect, the proletariat, and promised that after violently suppressing the forces of evil, the enlightened Leninist would establish an earthly utopia of social justice. It is impossible to miss the parallels between the Bolsheviks and the so-called social justice warriors of our own time. In fact, wokeness, as we Americans call it, is arguably better understood as a form of secular left-wing religion than as a social and political movement. In a powerful 2018 essay, James Lindsay and Mike Nana detailed the religious aspects of the broad social justice movement. They contend that the social justice movement fulfills the same psychological and social needs that religion once filled, but no longer can. Social justice warriors are members of what Lindsay calls an ideologically motivated moral community. They hold axiomatic beliefs that cannot be questioned, only accepted. Those beliefs give meaning and direction to their lives and provide a sense of shared mission. They really do believe that they're bringing about a world of justice and happiness. So what are those beliefs? A brief catechism of soft totalitarianism goes like this. The first belief is that the central fact of human existence is power and how it is used. Everything in life is understood through relationships of power. Social justice is the mission of reordering society to create more equitable power relationships. Those who resist social justice are practicing hate and cannot be reasoned with or in any way tolerated, only conquered. A second principle, that there is no such thing as objective truth, there is only power. Religious claims, philosophical arguments, political theories, all of these are veils concealing the will to power. They are only rationalizations for oppressors to hold power over the oppressed. The value of truth claims, they believe, depends on who is making them. Another principle of social justice warriors. Identity politics sorts the oppressed from the oppressors. In the cult of social justice, the oppressors are generally white, male, heterosexual, and Christian. The oppressed are racial minorities, women, sexual minorities, and religious minorities. Justice is not a matter of working out what is rightly due to the individual per se, but what is due to an individual as the bearer of group identity. This is why, to those guided by critical race theory, a black lesbian who teaches at Harvard is oppressed, while a white man who lives in a beat-up caravan in West Virginia and works as a garage mechanic is an oppressor. We have seen something like this before. In 1918, in the Soviet Union, Lenin unleashed the Red Terror, a campaign of annihilation against those who resisted Bolshevik power. Martin Latsis, who was the head of the secret police in Ukraine, instructed his agents as follows. This is a quote from Latsis. "Do not look in the file of incriminating evidence to see whether or not the accused rose up against the Soviets with arms or words. Ask him instead to which class he belongs. What is his background, his education, his profession? These are the questions that will determine the fate of the accused. That is the meaning and essence of the Red Terror." Now notice that an individual's words and deeds had nothing to do with determining his guilt or innocence. One was presumed guilty based entirely on one's class and social status. Communists justified the imprisonment, the ruin, and even the execution of people who stood in the way of progress as necessary to achieve historical justice over these alleged exploiters of privilege. Well, a softer, bloodless form of the same logic is at work in American institutions and in institutions throughout the West. Social justice progressives advance their malignant concept of justice in part by terrorizing dissenters as thoroughly as any inquisitor on the hunt for enemies of religious orthodoxy. Finally, they believe, the social justice warriors believe, that language creates realities. They believe that human nature is largely constructed through the use of linguistic conventions. This is why they focus heavily on what they call discourses, that is, the style and content of modes of speaking that, in their view, legitimize certain ways of being and delegitimize others. Woke enforcers tightly police the spoken and the written word, condemning speech that offends them as a form of violence. This is why in New York City, a progressive utopia, you can be fined thousands of dollars for using the wrong pronoun to address someone. Well, look, nobody expects the return of Stalinism with its state monopolies, with its crackpot economics, and its Gulag archipelago. But the outmoded idea that totalitarianism requires an Orwellian-style terror state is a big reason why we are so blind to the soft totalitarianism now taking shape. In fact, the Cold War concept that big business is the enemy of the statist Leviathan conceals the leading role that capitalism plays in this transformation of society. Today, an elite club of global megacorporations are more powerful than many countries. Walmart has more annual revenue than Spain, and more than twice as much as Russia. ExxonMobil is bigger in terms of revenue than India, Norway, or Turkey. As the international strategist Parag Khanna says, in a world where Apple has more cash on hand than 2/3 of the world's nations, corporations are likely to overtake all states in terms of power. And in an America that now runs on the internet, 5 companies, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, have an almost incalculable influence over public and private life. At the same time, and this is something new, big business has moved steadily to the left on social issues. Standard business practice long required staying out of controversial social issues on the grounds that taking sides in the culture war would be bad for business. That has changed. Today, these corporations, we call them woke capitalists, regard taking progressive stands on social justice issues like race and gay rights as a critical part of branding. Woke capitalist branding harnesses the unmatched propaganda resources of the advertising industry to send the message both implicitly and explicitly that the beliefs of social and religious conservatives and even some of the fundamental beliefs of the classical liberal tradition are obstacles to the common good. What's more, with the emergence of what the former Harvard Business School professor Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, the capabilities of major corporations to mine intimate details from the data individuals create on the internet and by using smartphones and other smart devices gives to big business immense power over the future of democracy. Most of us are unaware that we're being monitored by corporations in ways of which the KGB could only have dreamed. Consumer convenience is how we have learned to love Big Brother. We don't have to search the pages of dystopian literature for an example of how a future totalitarianism would likely work here in the West. We only have to look at China, where the communist state is using the reach and the power of the internet and artificial intelligence to build what it calls a social credit system to force citizens to conform. By using its all-seeing electronic eye to regulate personal status, individual liberties, and access to consumer goods and services, China is pioneering modern forms of soft totalitarianism. As the Chinese economy becomes cash-free, the Chinese state will have the power to make it impossible for ordinary people to buy or sell if they do not bow down before the Communist Party. We have most of the same technology here in the West, but we do not yet have the political impetus to use it. If enough of us become convinced that our safety and comfort would be better served by regulating and suppressing dissent, we will get a social credit system here. So what can we do about it? If emigres from the Soviet bloc are warning us about the rising tide of totalitarianism, then those who remained and suffered under communism and resisted it can advise us on how to fight back now and in the future. In talking to former anti-communist dissidents still living in Russia and Eastern Europe, I learned that they are afraid too of what they sense is coming, but they're also mystified about the forms it is taking. Over and over, as I was reporting this book in the East Bloc, I heard the same thing. At least under communism, the lines between good and evil were clear. Nevertheless, there are some clear lessons that we can learn and apply today. First, we have to commit ourselves to living in truth. Live not by lies, said Alexander Solzhenitsyn in his final communique to the Russian people before his forced exile. Even politically powerless people, he explained, could refuse to say, to write, to affirm, or distribute anything that distorts the truth. They could refuse to attend a demonstration or to sign on for a cause unless they truly believed in it. And they will not take part in a meeting in which no one can speak the truth. So if somebody tells you today that you have to prove your good faith by signing this or publicly agreeing to that or putting this flag up or this sign up, even though you don't believe in it, then you have no choice but to refuse. Your own integrity is on the line. Second, we must accept the burden of suffering for the truth. This is how we show what we are made of. This is how we demonstrate our character. The new soft totalitarianism is taking hold among people, especially of the younger generation, who are terrified by discomfort, much less suffering. They are unnerved when confronted by thoughts or expressions that upset them. They would rather not have Big Brother, but Big Mama and Big Daddy shut down all freedom of speech and expression to protect them from having to suffer the knowledge of a challenging opinion. Here's a story, a true story, that a friend of mine who went to Harvard told me. 2 years ago, I was in Boston on business, and I discovered that an old friend from Europe had been studying at Harvard for a year, doing graduate work. I invited him to lunch, and I asked him over lunch, what is the most important thing you learned in your year here at the greatest university in America? And he thought about it for a moment and said, the most important thing I learned is how fragile the American elite are. I said, what? What do you mean by that? He said, when I started classes here, we would go into the classroom and the professor would say, class, today we will not talk about this subject and that subject because some of you came to me before the class and said that it's too triggering. It would make you feel unsafe to talk about it, so we won't talk about it. My European friend said, we Europeans in the class looked at each other and thought, is this real? But it was real, and it wasn't only in one class. This happened all the time. My friend said, it was really frightening to me as a European whose country depends on a strong America, because here I was watching the next ruling class of America at the most important university in the United States be afraid to hear thoughts that frightened them. He said the thing is, none of them doubted that it was their destiny to rule the world, but they were afraid of reality. He said things are not going to end well for any of us. So how are people who cannot even bear disagreement going to find it within themselves to withstand real suffering for the sake of the truth? They cannot, and they will not. In fact, they will happily impose that suffering on others to create a so-called safe space. And they might succeed because in this world, you often see people in charge of institutions like universities who are eager to throw dissenters to the wolves in order to appease the progressive mob. We have to be ready to resist them, no matter what it costs us. In 1977, the Czech anti-communist dissident Václav Havel published The Parable of a Greengrocer who refused to hang a sign in his shop window saying, "Workers of the world unite." Well, in the parable, this gets him in trouble. He loses business. He loses his privileges and his status. His family becomes a pariah. But the greengrocer has won a great moral victory. He has shown that it is possible to live in truth, to take a stand for one's convictions, and to refuse to conform. This, in time, can destabilize the tyrannical government. Havel wrote about the greengrocer, "He has shown everyone that it is possible to live within the truth. Living within the lie can constitute the system only if it is universal. The principle must embrace and permeate everything." So if you're willing to suffer for the truth, you show other people that it is possible to live in truth. But suffering is the key. Suffering, all these dissidents I talked to told me, is more bearable when it is rooted in religious conviction or some other transcendent ideal. Christians especially, and I'm a Christian myself, we have to throw away this weak, Jesus is my best friend style of Christianity. We have to rediscover the faith of the martyrs and the confessors, a faith that is strong enough to endure suffering as the cost of discipleship. Nothing else will get us through what is to come. Alexander Ogorodnikov, a Russian Orthodox Christian and a prominent dissident of the Brezhnev era, is a man whose face bears evidence of his torture in prison. It's partially paralyzed from his beatings. Ogorodnikov told me that suffering people need, quote, a golden dream, something to live for, a conception of hope. You can't simply be against everything bad. You have to be for something good, he said. Otherwise, you can get really dark and crazy. Third, we should build solidarity within small groups. In Bratislava, in a cramped, hidden chamber accessible only by a tunnel that went underneath the basement, the historian Jan Simulček told me how the underground Slovak Catholic Church produced samizdat there. As a college student in the 1980s, Simulček was part of a secret cell that distributed the illegal literature printed there. He told me that he learned how to be free in the fellowship of the young men in that Catholic group. He said to me, only in small communities could people feel free. That is to say, in devotion to each other and to the causes of their Christian faith and to freedom. In that solidarity, the young men gradually overcame their fear of communist totalitarianism. Simulček told me, we helped one another to gradually build up the courage to do bigger things. Zofia Romaszewska, a former organizer with the Polish trade union Solidarity, told me, quote, as I see it, this is the core. This is the essence of everything right now. Forming these communities and networks of communities, whatever kind of communities you can imagine. The point is that the members of that community must be very supportive of one another, no matter what comes, unquote. Fourth, in the face of soft totalitarianism, dissidents should cultivate cultural memory. Cultivate cultural memory. What do I mean by that? That is, they should immerse themselves, their families, and their small groups in the study of history, of art, of literature, religion, and of all of the things that make our culture distinct. Totalitarian movements always seek to erase a people's history and culture from the collective memory because it makes those people easier to manipulate. We cannot let them do it. In an interview with me months before his death from cancer, Sir Roger Scruton reflected on the key role that private seminars held in the homes of dissidents played in keeping cultural memory alive in the face of communist annihilation. These meetings were not merely casual lectures by scholars to keep audiences entertained amid the boredom of totalitarianism. These were a means of cultural survival. In the 1980s, prominent Western academics like Charles Taylor, Jacques Derrida, and Roger Scruton worked with Czech dissidents to build an underground university in which true scholarship, not ideological nonsense, was possible. In an interview not long before his death in 2019, Sir Roger, who was once detained by the Czech secret police, told me that when he and his British colleagues first visited Czechoslovakia in the late 1970s, they were astonished to discover that Czechs, quote, were determined to cling to their cultural inheritance because they thought it contained the truth, not just about their history, but the truth about their soul, about what they fundamentally are. Sir Roger told me that was the thing that the communists could not take away. Well, this is something that we're losing now, and not just because of woke schools and universities and the media. Tamás Shai, a teacher in Budapest, told me that the generations that came of age after the fall of communism have fallen into an abyss of Western-style hedonism and consumerism. He said to me, what neither Nazism or communism could do, victorious liberal capitalism has done. He meant by that the post-communist generation of Hungarians has forgotten their history and their literature and don't understand why it's important. Finally, a lesson that runs through the testimonies of many dissidents is the stark warning to the Western democracies. It can happen in your country too. Solzhenitsyn wrote, there is always this fallacious belief, it would not be the same here. Here, such things are impossible. Alas, he said, all the evil of the 20th century is possible in every country on earth. In Live Not by Lies, I tell the story of a conversation I had with a 26-year-old California woman who told me that she considered herself to be a communist because she loves the dream of universal brotherhood and equality. I asked her, okay, so what about the gulags? She had no idea what I was talking about. Now, this young woman is university educated, but she was born after the end of the Cold War. Nobody ever explained to her what communism really was. Traveling here in Central Europe over the past few months, I have been shocked to learn that the post-communist generation here has been so focused on the future that so many of them have not learned the lessons of the past. That kind of historical ignorance and moral arrogance is going to destroy us and destroy our democracies if we don't fight back. So most of the great Russian and European anti-communists, Solzhenitsyn, Havel, Czesław Miłosz, Karol Wojtyła, the Pope John Paul II, they're dead, and the generations that lived under Soviet totalitarianism are passing into history. Our news and entertainment media have largely erased their stories and canceled their voices from neglect. But some of them are still alive, and they want us all to know and to know urgently that something wicked this way comes. They can feel it in their bones. A Soviet-born university professor in the American Midwest told me, "You will not be able to predict what will be held against you tomorrow." This woman is grieved by the sight of her Midwestern students. She said, "They're good kids. They were raised in the cornfields." Openly professing socialism and embracing in the name of social justice a culture that harshly punishes heterodoxy and silences dissent. She told me, "You have no idea what completely normal thing you do today or say today will be used against you to destroy you. This is what people in the Soviet Union saw. We know how this works." And nobody will listen to her in America. I dedicated this book, Live Not by Lies, to the memory of Father Tomislav Kolakovic, a Croatian Catholic priest. In 1943, Father Kolakovic was doing anti-Nazi resistance work in Zagreb when he received information that the Germans were coming to arrest him. He escaped from Croatia and went to hide in Slovakia, his mother's home country. He began teaching in the Catholic University in Bratislava. The priest told his students that the good news is the Germans are going to lose the war. The bad news is that the Soviets are going to be ruling their country when the war was over, and the first thing the Soviets were going to do was going to persecute the church. They had to be ready, the priest told them. So Father Kolakovic formed small groups of faithful young Catholics who had come together to talk about what was happening in their country and to discuss how to build a resistance. Within 2 years, these groups spread all across Slovakia. The Slovak Catholic bishops warned Father Kolakovic to stop what he was doing. They told him he was alarming people for no reason. But the priest did not stop. He understood the communist mind better than they did. And so, in 1948, when the communists seized power in Czechoslovakia, everything happened exactly as Father Kolakovic predicted. His network of young Catholics formed the backbone of the underground Catholic Church. They kept the faith alive through the next 40 years of totalitarian dictatorship. My friends, I firmly believe that today we are all living in a Kolakovic moment. I don't know when the persecution will begin or what forms it will take, but I know that it is coming and that we have to be ready for it. And we don't have forever to think about this. I believe that God has sent us the testimonies of these old dissidents that I write about in the book and the old dissidents who are still alive in this country, Slovenia, to wake us up and to call us to prepare. Do we have the courage and the wisdom to listen? Thank you. You can't imagine what an honor it is for me to be able to give a talk like that in a country that used to be communist. As an American who grew up in the Cold War, I never imagined that I would ever be able to visit countries like Slovenia, but Slovenia is free now, and here I am, and thanks be to God for all that. But let's all commit ourselves to keeping Slovenia free and to protecting our liberties and to protecting our faith and our right to speak freely and to be heard without being punished. If anyone would like to ask some questions, I think we have a little bit of time. Don't we, David?
Yes, of course. Vprašanje, prosim, če ima kdo, lahko tudi v slovenščini bo prevajalec gospoda Dreherja prevajalcev. Izvolite.
Do you think that the current crisis happening in the West is done by accident or design?
Accident or design? Well, if you're asking, do I have a conspiratorial idea of it, I don't think so, but I do believe that there are people who want this to happen. I'll give you an example. I've been working in Hungary for the past few months as a visiting fellow of the Danube Institute. And one of the first things you discover as an American when you go to Hungary is that there's a lot of talk about George Soros. Now, when I first heard that, I thought surely they're being conspiracy theorists. But then the more you look into what George Soros actually does, you realize that they have a point. They really do have a point. Today, for example, this is not really Soros, but this is the European Commission. Hungary is now under a lot of pressure by the European Commission for this new LGBT law that limits what can be said to children about LGBT, gender ideology, things like that, both in the media and in sex education. You can disagree with the law. I mean, a lot of Hungarians do disagree with the law, but it was passed by a democratic majority. If the people don't like it, they can vote the parliament out next year. Well, as you've probably all seen, the European Commission has gone insane over this, and the Prime Minister of the Netherlands said that he will bring Hungary to its knees. Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the European Commission, has said that Hungary will face the full force of EU law. And I have to wonder, what is it about something as small as this that can cause so much power to come down on one country? These are things that are happening by powerful people, powerful liberals, powerful leftists in concert with each other. And I think what has happened is liberals no longer believe that liberalism means pluralism, means diversity, means tolerance for difference. They believe it means cultural hegemony. It means that everybody has to do exactly as they say or else. I think that it is certainly true that elites within different institutions are working together to make this happen. And I don't think this is a secret conspiracy theory either. The sociologist James Davison Hunter, an American sociologist, said that revolution and major cultural changes happen when elites and elite networks agree on a certain idea and start putting those ideas into institutions. That is what has happened in the US right now with wokeness. It's incredible to think about. Do you know what I mean by wokeness? I'm talking about the whole general cancel culture, social justice, etc. It started out in universities and then spread to the media, but quickly now it has taken over every institution of civil society. It has taken over big business, most importantly. It has taken over sports. It has taken over the arts. It has taken over even the CIA and the American military. It's incredible. There is no major institution in American life that has not completely given itself over to this ideology. And you begin to see how powerful it is when that has happened. When I was in Hungary earlier this summer, I interviewed a man named Peter Kreko. He is a very articulate critic of Viktor Orban. He's a university professor. I wanted to speak to somebody who was critical of Orban so I could understand their complaints. One of the things he said was, you know, I don't like this government because I support gay marriage, I support gay adoption. Our government doesn't, and I hate that. But, said Kreko, I don't really agree with transgender ideology. And then we went on to talk about other things. At the end of our conversation, Kreko said, but I'll say in the end, I can stand in my classroom here in Budapest and say whatever I want, and no one from the state will come attack me. I said, Peter, that's really interesting, because in the United States, you could say exactly what you said at the beginning of the interview, that you support gay rights but not transgender, and nobody from the state would bother you, but your students would turn on you. They would go to the head of the university, demand that you be fired. They would probably fire you, and after you got fired, your reputation would be ruined, and you would never be able to teach anywhere else again. Now, this is all happening in a liberal democracy. It's not coming from the state. It's coming from these institutions which have been completely captured by wokeness. So, Peter, who is more free? You here in Orban's Hungary or your American liberal counterpart? Well, he didn't have an answer for that, but you see the point. This is how soft totalitarianism works when it captures institutions. I'll give you another example. Earlier this year, Amazon.com said that it will no longer publish books that portray transgenderism as a mental disorder. They won't sell them anymore. Well, that's Amazon's right to do that. No bookseller can be forced to sell a book that he doesn't want to. I don't want the little Christian bookseller to be forced to sell the Satanic Bible. I support Amazon's right to do this. But here's the thing. Amazon is so big and controls so much of the US book market that if it decides it will not publish a certain kind of book, then those books won't get published by anybody. So Amazon, making a free decision, completely legal, ends up removing an entire category of book from public discourse. It's incredible. And this is the sort of thing we're dealing with. But again, the state's not involved at all. This is a private company making a decision that's perfectly within its rights to do. But this is how it's affecting democracy. So you ask me, is this planned? Yes and no. It is all these people who believe the same things working together, but I don't believe it is a sinister conspiracy. Sure.
I
have a question about your book. Is it sold on Amazon? And if so, are you worried about the possible punishment for your from Amazon?
Yeah. It is sold by Amazon, and I am increasingly worried about this. The book is sold very well in the US. We've sold well over 100,000 copies, even though no media have talked about it. Every book I've written in the past has gotten lots of good coverage. This is the first one that has had nothing from the major media, only from podcasts and small groups, small publishers. And we've seen in Romania, the book is published in Romania. In Romania, Facebook kicked a journalist off of Facebook for publishing an interview he did with me when I was in Romania. In Hungary, Facebook in Hungary told a conservative magazine to stop publishing things from me, about me, because Rod Dreher is dangerous, they say. I mean, that feels great. Facebook thinks I'm dangerous, but in the end, though, it does worry me that if these companies start doing that, start saying that we will not sell dangerous books or we won't give a platform to dangerous ideas, that could be the destruction of my livelihood, the way I feed my family. This is starting to happen to people. Two people I follow online, Brett Weinstein and his wife Heather Heying. They're both left-wing atheist academics in the US who were forced out of their university because they refused to accept wokeness, even though they're on the left. But they have enough self-respect to refuse to be told what they can and can't say by this student mob. Well, they built a career by doing podcasts online. Well, recently YouTube decided that it doesn't like them and kicked them off of YouTube. That takes away half of their family's income. They're trying to find another way to do it, but you begin to see how much it matters to people's ability to speak freely and to make money if these companies, this handful of companies who have so much power over our discourse, choose to use it that way. I don't know if you've seen this, but in America now, Facebook has started a new program sending some people warnings that they might have been exposed to extremism from their friends. And if you say something that Facebook censors believe might be extremist, people can report it to Facebook, and they can send out a warning to everybody in that person's network saying, careful, you've been in touch with an extremist. You don't have to be a genius to see where this is going. And in America, since the January 6th attack on the Capitol, which was a disgusting attack, absolutely wrong, but the government has taken powers after that to go after what it calls domestic extremism. Well, what are the boundaries there of domestic extremism? How much will ordinary political dissent be counted as extremism? When we see in the schools and universities and in the media, when you see simple disagreement with the woke being described as hate speech or a form of violence, it's easy to imagine where this can go, where in the name of protecting America and the public from violence, they have to shut down any speech that disagrees with the left-wing line. It's really concerning. So quick, buy the book now before I have to say, too, that there are a number of us who are now starting to realize that we have to start buying not electronic books, but hardcover books, and not music in the cloud, but actual compact disc or records, because we believe these things may be taken away from us. It's already happening with some movies that from the past that suddenly failed the test of wokeness are being withdrawn. And if you want to protect these cultural memories, start buying hardcovers. Don't just rely on electronic books. I love electronic books because it makes it easier for me to do my research, but I really do believe in the next 20 or 30 years, maybe even sooner, the only libraries that we can be sure will still exist will be those that exist in hardcover. Somebody else, a question? Yes?
Thank you for a very good talk and for your time. I have a question. How do you see these small communities forming? You mentioned, like in these communist states, there were like small dissident groups, underground groups. So how do you see them forming now? Like maybe, I don't know, traditional Latin Mass groups or Orthodox Christians, or how do you see?
Yeah, I think that Sofia Romaszewska, the Polish woman, was right that whether it happens around churches or around groups of hunters or anything, we have to come together and talk about these things. I have been really excited in following the work of my previous book called The Benedict Option to see some Christians coming together to live in small community. It isn't happening in a lot of places, but it is starting to happen. In France, for example, I was just in France on the book tour for Live Not by Lies, and I met these two young Catholics, both in their 30s, businessmen, and they have created a new company to help Catholic families move out of the cities and move out into the countryside to live around monasteries. They want to do this so families who want to build their lives around monasteries can actually do it financially. And they have already 1,000 families signed up for this and 32 monasteries participating. I think that's fantastic, but I think it's going to require a lot of courage and creativity on the part of all of us to make these things happen. You know, one of the things that I find interesting about the Father Kolakovic story is the leaders of the Catholic Church in 1940 Slovakia were the ones who didn't see it coming. They wanted to pretend that everything was okay. But it took priests like Kolakovic, and there was another priest, a priest named Vladimir Yukol, and lay people who had the vision to make these things happen. It's going to be the same thing today. We can't sit around and wait for somebody else to tell us what to do. We have to seize the initiative ourselves. So many people are afraid, and they want to believe that somebody is going to stop this, it's all going to be okay. And look, we hope it will be. I don't want this to happen, but we can't just hope that something will happen to fix the problem. We've got to get ready for it ourselves. And I think a lot about something that this woman in Prague told me. Her name is Kamila Bendova. She was the widow of Václav Benda, one of the only Christians in Václav Havel's inner circle of dissidents. I asked Camilla, I said, Camilla, you and your late husband are very strict Catholics. You were the only religious believers in Havel's inner circle. Did you find it difficult to work with people who believed such radically different things than you and your husband? And she told me no. She said that in those days, you have to remember that very few Christians had the courage to stand up. Very few people of any kind had the courage to stand up. When you found someone who had the courage, you had to stand with them. They became your best friend. She said that's what we did with these people who didn't share our faith, but they shared our courage, and they saw us the same way. They didn't agree with anything we believed in terms of religion or politics, but they knew that we had the courage to refuse totalitarianism. I think that sort of thing has to happen today. We cannot assume that everybody we go to church with or everybody we're friends with is going to have the same courage. We have to find the people who do share courage and to build these strong relationships with them. And also invite into these circles people who are sitting around waiting to see, is somebody going to do something? Invite them in. Let them see that you're doing something good. And it can't be paranoia. It can't be built around that. As Alexander Ogorodnikov said, you know, you can't just be against something, you have to be for something. But it does have to be focused and committed. And I think that this is a great opportunity for us all to build these communities. Even if nothing bad happens in the end, we all need stronger communities. We live in a time of mass atomization and loneliness. What better reason to come together now and rediscover our neighbors? Václav Benda, Camilla's husband, under communism, he knew that he couldn't do anything to fight politically, but he said one thing he could do to fight the system was to bring people together to remind themselves that we're all neighbors. Sometimes he would bring them together for nothing more than to have a picnic. But he realized that totalitarianism depended on everybody being separate and everybody feeling like they were all alone. They were crazy and they were all alone. If you could convince people that they're not crazy to believe the things they do and they're not by themselves, you'll give them hope. In fact, when I was in Romania last month promoting this book, the Romanian publisher said, look, we don't know how many people are going to come here. You speak tonight. We hope we get 100. We hope we sell 50 books. We had 500 people come from all over Romania, and we sold 400 books. And it was shocking to me and shocking to them. But all these Romanians from the countryside, they were all Christians. They came and they kept saying the same thing. living here in our country, we are told by our media and by our leaders all the time that as Christians, we're backward people. As social conservatives, there's something wrong with us. We have to change. We have to be ashamed of ourselves. We have to become progressive in order to be modern, proper Europeans. They said, thank you for coming here and telling us that we're not crazy and we're not alone and that we should be proud of who we are and our traditions. And they said, it matters a lot that you're an American and came to tell us this. And for me, it was just a matter of such honor to be used by God to be in that position. Because I told them, look, we Americans, we need to learn from you. You survived communism. You didn't lose your faith. We're now facing a much more subtle form of totalitarianism. So please, let's establish these friendships across national lines and across the ocean so we can help each other resist. Sorry for that long sermon, but people really are excited to find each other. And I have been really fortunate also in Europe as I've done speaking about this book and about my last book, The Benedict Option, which is about how Christians can survive in a post-Christian world. I've been so lucky to meet so many young Catholics aged 40 and under who understand exactly the crisis that we're in. I find that Christians my age, I'm 54 and older, and a lot of young Christians in America don't really understand the nature of the crisis. But here in Europe, in my experience, young Catholics who are still going to Mass, they get it. They understand that the situation the church is in, and they're prepared to be what Pope Benedict said we should all be, creative minorities in this time. And so I find actually I get more hope from being over here in Europe among young Catholics than I do in my own country, even though so many more people hold the faith or profess the faith in America. I think the future of Christianity is going to be decided in a strange way here in Europe, where the faith is today flat on its back. Somebody else?
How woke have become the churches in America?
How woke are the churches? You know, that's such a great question. And I don't know about Europe, but, well, I know about Germany, very woke. But in the U.S., the churches are starting to fall. Most of the mainline Protestant churches are completely gone. They're either into gender ideology, everything LGBT, and Black Lives Matter, critical race theory. What's interesting, though, is you're now starting to see some of the conservative evangelical churches begin to fall apart around Black Lives Matter, which is really interesting because I think with LGBT, the conservative churches know that there's really no way to reconcile what the church teaches with what gay rights folks are asking for. But racism is evil. It's clear from Christian teaching that racism is evil. So a lot of these white churches are so eager to take a stand against racism that they are rushing emotionally to accept anything Black Lives Matter and the critical race theory people say as a way of dealing with their own sense of guilt. So I would have thought that a lot of these conservative churches would hold the line against wokeness, but it's happening in some places, but not in as many as I wish it was happening. And among Catholics in America, it's really, really interesting. You have some woke bishops, but most, from what I can tell, most bishops and most priests don't want to take a stand one way or the other at all. They want to avoid trouble. Because, and understandably, my own priest, I'm an Orthodox Christian, but my own priest said he doesn't want to talk about these things in the church because he doesn't want politics to come into the church. I respect that. We don't need politics dividing our congregation. But some of these things are things we have to talk about as Christians. Gender ideology, for example, it is everywhere in America. It's in the schools, it's in the popular culture, it's in children's cartoons even. But so people like my priest, who's a very good man, and who's very conservative and gives very compassionate, faithful homilies, even he doesn't want to deal with some of this. So I think I have less fear of the actual woke churches than I do from the many more churches which aren't woke or anti-woke, but just want to be neutral and not take a stand and pretend this is all going to go away. It's not going to go away. It just isn't.
Še zadnje vprašanje? Ja, prosim, gospod.
Hi. So apparently it's in human nature that we only realize what freedoms we have when they are in real danger, when we realize there's a danger. So during Cold War, something like this woke stuff would not be conceivable because there was a clear difference between the good and the evil. Today it's different. Today Bernie Sanders, who went on his honeymoon to the Soviet Union, is liable to be the presidential candidate for the president of the United States. So apparently we don't realize the danger. Do you think that with the global rise of China, there would be something in that fashion that we would realize, okay, there's a danger for our freedoms, so we have to do something to conserve that? Thank you.
That's a great question. Before I talk about China, I want to say something your Bernie Sanders question brought up. I tell this story in the book. When I was in Russia doing research for the book, I had spent a couple of days interviewing Gulag survivors, people like that, and I went to dinner at the home of a Russian family, Russian Orthodox family. And I said at the dinner table, I don't understand how communism ever appealed to anybody in this country. The father said, you don't understand it? Let me tell you. And he went through a narrative of 300 years of Russian history in which the ruling class, often with the church helping it, oppressed poor people in a terrible way. And he said, when he got to the early 20th century, he said, look, Bolshevism was evil, but you have to understand that it gave people a sense of hope, people who were really suffering and who didn't believe in the old system anymore. And I appreciated him saying that, because today, when people like me, conservatives, look out at our society and wonder, how can anybody believe in this woke nonsense? I think we need to stop and think more about why it might appeal to people. For example, these young people, if you're raised in America today, you are part of a culture in which there's nothing stable, where everything seems to be fluid, where on the internet, you know, if you're a kid and your parents give you access to the internet, you can easily find yourself on in a web page where there are 26 different gender identities, and you're being told to choose it. This is an actual story. I talked to someone in Slovenia who said this was happening to their kid. This sort of thing is happening everywhere. And people also see injustice in the world. They want to do something about it. There's nothing wrong with that. We should want to fight injustice. But with the loss of a tradition in our country, with the loss of Christianity, with the loss of a sense of stability, you see young people searching for anything that can give them what they crave, that sense of meaning. I think it was the Polish dissident Czesław Miłosz who said that one thing that Americans don't understand is that people can believe in some pretty dark and dangerous things as long as it gives them a sense of meaning. And he was talking about why people chose to believe communism. And I think that is something that we're having to deal with today. And as crazy as wokeness is, I don't think we're going to get anywhere, people like me, in fighting it until we try to understand more why it appeals to young people today and their fear and their anxiety. Now, going to the China question, the thing that worries me about China is I don't think that people sense it as a threat to us. And I'm speaking about my country, I don't know about Europe, but we see China as the source of so many consumer goods. And there just isn't right now, at least, the sense that China is any sort of danger. I think that we ought to be looking at the social credit system in China as a danger if it comes to us. But again, if you have a population, and I'm talking mostly about the young now, who actually want authority to take a firm stand and to defend them from having to hear any thought that bothers them or having to be confronted with any practice or a set of clothes or anything that makes them anxious, then they'll see China not as a threat, but as a model for what to do. You know, I tell a story in this book about what I think is one of the most important moments in the cultural history of our time. It happened on the campus of Yale University in the fall of 2015. You can see all this on YouTube, by the way. That fall, the Yale University sent a message to all the students saying, be careful the sort of costumes you wear at Halloween. You don't want to trigger somebody. You don't want to make someone feel oppressed or etc. Unsafe. Well, there at Yale, the students live in residential colleges, and each residential college has what they call masters, usually a husband and a wife who live there as the kind of house parents. Well, the house parents of this one particular college were called Erica and Nicholas Christakis. The Christakises were professors at Yale who lived there to help take care of the students. Erica Christakis happens to be one of America's top experts in child psychological development. And she sent an email to the students of her house saying, you know, it's really not good for us adults in authority to be, to hover over kids, to protect them from everything. By the time they're your age, she said, you need to be experiencing these things. It's not the place at this university to tell you what costumes you can and can't wear. Well, in my generation and in the previous generation, we would have said, yeah, thank you for standing up for us. Not this generation. The students in that college went crazy. They started screaming bloody murder about how dare you attack us like this. You need to be defending us, making us feel at home. You can go into YouTube and see Erica Christakis' husband, Nicholas Christakis, a good liberal baby boomer, going onto the campus to meet with the student mob, maybe 100 kids, to try to reason with them. He's trying to reason with them in a good, rational, liberal way. He's listening to them, answering their questions, wanting them to engage in dialogue, but they don't want dialogue. You see these kids, some of them are crying, they're shrieking, they're cursing at him, they're demanding that he say he's sorry. It's like something out of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. They don't want to have any dialogue, they want what they want right now. Well, what do you think happened? Yale University took the side of the students, the Christakises were out, and Erica Christakis left the university. This is the American elite. Yale is one of the top universities in America. An entire elite are being raised to think that it's the purpose of authority to clamp down on our freedoms to protect us from anxiety, from thoughts that make us feel unsafe. This is why I believe that this younger generation will be the ones to accept the social credit system, and not only to accept it, but to demand it. To say in the book that there's a young American intellectual named James Polos who came up with a great phrase to describe what he believes is coming. He calls it the pink police state. Pink in the terms of being therapeutic. He says that we're going to a state where a regime in which people will happily give over their political liberties, give away their political liberties like free speech, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, in exchange for being made to feel safe, to practice, to have personal pleasure, like smoking pot, having as many sexual partners as they want, etc. This, he believes, is going to be the end of liberalism. And if he's right, then we are moving very quickly to Huxley's Brave New World. I hope it doesn't happen, but like Father Kolakovich said, we have to be ready for it, be ready to defend our liberties, and if we're Christian, defend our faith and live with it no matter what comes. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. I appreciate it. I hope you'll buy the book. You might not agree with everything in it, but I hope it makes you think about what we need to be doing right now while we still have the freedom to do so. Good night.
Hvala lepa za vaš obisk, za tole čudovito predavanje. Thank you very much for this speech. Hvala tudi vam za številčen obisk. Privoščim vam lepe urice branja te knjige in predvsem globok pomislek, ki ga odnesite s seboj v vsakdanje življenje. Hvala in lep večer še naprej.
Let's have a round of applause for the interpreter, Peter. I don't know how he translated woke, but when I was in France recently, I noticed in the French newspapers they call wokeness le wokisme. So, what would it be in Slovenian?
I will ask him how he translated it. Nisem poslušal prevoda, in poslušal, kako je woke. Kaj? Wokizm.
Wokism. All right. Well, I'll sign it. If anybody has a book they want me to sign, please bring a pen.